Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of 4 workshops organized by CLEF. It is what it is. It would have been nice to mingle and see each other, but this is a very good way of staying in touch and staying active. And I don't know how many of you attended Friday's session. Mikhail gave a fantastic introduction to why this is more relevant than ever in terms of policy, in terms of how we deal with, and even those papers that were prepared in advance, they still have relevance for today's questions about COVID and labor market. And today we have 2 papers, Andriana Bellu and Lee-Pierre Lepage. Andriana is going to talk to us about women and the Great Depression. Lee-Pierre is going to talk to us about how employers learn, endogenous learning, and biases that persist. In terms of housekeeping, all your mics are muted. So what you're going to do, if you have questions, type them in the question box, and they'll come and we'll collect them as they arrive. At the end of the presentations, we'll summarize them for the presenters, and they'll have a chance to respond. Each presentation will be targeted to a 20-minute presentation, give or take a couple of more minutes, and then each presenter will respond. And then at the end, if there is any more general questions that the presenters can address, we'll try to leave a little time at the end to do so. We are going to target to finish around 1:30. So I'm going to start introducing the first paper, but before doing so, again, a big word of thanks to Anna Ferrer, the CLEF organizer, without whom this wouldn't have happened. She put together everything. And Grant Gibson, who is the technical person making this possible. So once I'm done with the introduction, I'll also mute myself and take my camera off, and we'll start with Andriana Bellu from University of Montreal, who is going to talk to us about women and their labor supply following the Great Depression. Extremely relevant. Maybe she'll write the same paper about COVID a couple of months from now. So Andriana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Miana, and okay, let me share my screen. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. This is joint work with my colleague Emanuela Cardia, and it's part of a broader research agenda on the long-term effects of the Great Depression in the United States. I would like to start with a couple of well-documented facts about female employment in the first half of the 20th century. So as is well known, before 1930, women would usually permanently retire from the labor market upon marriage. However, for the more recent cohorts that were born at the turn of the 20th century, we observe a stark change. As you can see on this graph, which displays women's employment shares by age group and over time from 1930 to 1960, while the more recent cohorts that were born late 1800, early 1900 had very similar employment shares in early adulthood to other cohorts, this changes in later life. So the more recent cohort work more when older. So for instance, women 45 to 54 years old in 1930, less than 20% of them were working, while in 1960, more than 40% of women in that group are working. So the graph looks pretty similar for the married women, and given the bias that existed at the time, this is even more striking. So while there is a significant literature documenting these trends and discussing driving forces such as the World War II or increased educational attainment, we do contribute in that literature by asking whether this substantial macroeconomic shock that lasted nearly a decade, whether it contributed at all in shaping those trends. So a priori, the relationship between the Great Depression and female employment is ambiguous. It could go either way. Women could have been attracted in the labor market via an added worker effect, and there is plenty of support by economic historians such as Bolin and Finnegan and Margot for an added worker effect. This is a reasonable argument. Males experienced very high unemployment rates, more than 20% during the Great Depression. Persistent unemployment, households across the income distribution faced significant income cuts, And many households had accumulated huge amounts of consumer debt and mortgage debt and were at risk of default at the onset of the Great Depression. So all these elements could have pushed households to send additional workers in the labor force in order to make up for losses in terms of assets or household income. And the more substantial these losses, the more likely that these additional workers will have extended their presence in the labor market. On the other hand, the 1930s was a period of reduced labor demand. And while prohibitions to women's employment existed, the so-called marriage bars also existed before 1930 in various forms, implicit or explicit. They became even more stringent during the 1930s and inhibited the presence, the entry of married women in the paid labor force. So in other words, the relationship between the two, the Great Depression and female employment, is an empirical question that we try to tackle in this paper. To do so, we rely on data that come from two main data sources. First, we're using individual level data from the IPUMS USA. We pulled together cross-sections from 1910, 30, 40, 50, and 60. And our outcome of interest is whether an individual is currently employed. This is because this is the most comparable over time measure that we have in the IPUMS in terms of employment. We will be mainly looking at white individuals from non-farm households, not in group quarters and born in the United States. We will supplement this data with information on economic conditions. Our primary measure of economic performance is the business failure rate, a measure that closely tracks the real GDP. It is available since the beginning of the century from 1896 at an annual level and state level, and covers big sectors in the economy: manufacturing, trade, construction, some commercial services, but not banks, not finance sector, insurance, or real estate. In terms of the research design, our thought experiment is to compare the work behavior of women in different age brackets in post-depression years to that of women in the same age brackets in pre-depression years. We will have two temporal horizons in the analysis. In the short run, we will be pulling together the 1910, 30, and 40 cross-sections, and we will be focusing on ages between 15 and 64 years old. Individuals in that age group in 1940 were of working age at the onset of the Great Depression and therefore could have been directly treated by the shock. Individuals in the 1930 cross-section, we believe that they were likely untreated, and the reason is that the census was conducted in April 1st of 1930, so just 6 months after the October 1929 crash, and therefore this left very little time for female labor supply to respond. And by definition, those in the 1910 cross-section are going to be untreated. In the long-run analysis, we will supplement this pooled sample with one more cross-section, the 1960 cross-section. And what we will be doing is that we are going to follow this pseudo cohort that was possibly treated and was of working age in 1940, 20 years later, when these people are 35 to 64 years old, and basically ask whether there are any permanent effects. So in the long run, we are going to compare the work behavior of 35 to 64-year-olds, predominantly in 1960, to that of 35 to 64-year-olds in previous decades. In terms of specification, we will estimate the following versions of the following general form. Our dependent variable is an indicator for whether woman I in year T and age group A is currently employed. This will be regressed on a measure of economic conditions in year T at the state of residence of the individual, a measure of the Great Depression that I will define in the next slide, and which will allow it to vary differentially over time. World War II mobilization taken from Asimoglu and Al. A vector of individual characteristics, including age, fixed effects for state of residence and state of birth, calendar year fixed effects, division year interactions to account for possibly unobserved factors, time varying at the division level, possibly confounding the effects of the variables we're interested in, and finally of a vector of 1910 state characteristics. Our measure of the Great Depression is the difference between the average business failure rate in the core depression years, an average of 1929 to 1932, relative to another pre-depression point, so average failures between 1909 and 1912. Our estimates do not hinge on the choice of this particular point. Just one word before I proceed to the results. In terms of identification, the analysis relies on the parallel trends assumption, stating that in the absence of the shock, we shouldn't observe female labor supply to trend differently across states with varying degrees of business failures. Of course, since failures vary across regions, one could expect that the same observables that drive that variation would also impact on our employment outcomes. To try to mitigate this possibility as much as possible, on top of the state fixed effects and the division year interactions, we are going to control for the demographic composition of the state, the economic condition of the state, and the industrial composition in a pre-depression point, which is 1910. This will include in all specifications, and on top of that, we are conducting a series of robustness and falsification checks to make sure that our results are robust and rule out other potential confounding factors. So I'll go straight to the results. Again, in the short run, we're pulling together the 1910, 30, and 40 cross-sections, and we compare work employment shares for women in different age brackets in different decades. So the first message to retain is that in states more severely impacted by the shock, women 25 to 44 years old in 1940 are more likely to work. The effects also extend to the slightly younger women, the 20 to 24-year-olds that turn working age in the early 1930s. Interestingly, there are no effects for the 16 to 19-year-olds that were children at the time of the shock, and no effects for the slightly older individuals, 45 to 64 years old in 1940. We also observed no effects in 1940, apart from a marginally significant coefficient for the 20 to 24-year-olds, which would be indicative of the fact that indeed, because of the timing of the census, there was very little time for labor supply to respond. Now, the next question that we ask is which group of women is driving these results? An added worker effect would imply that women respond more relative to men, something that we see in the data when we pull together men and women, and we would also expect that married women are going to respond more than the unmarried women. And indeed, when we interact our variable of interest with an indicator for whether or not the individual was currently married, we do observe that married women are more likely to work than unmarried women. In terms of magnitude, if I evaluate the effect for married women at the average change in failure rates between peak and trough, this suggests a 4.4 percentage point increase in the propensity to work, or a 40% increase relative to the 1930 employment of married women. We did a number of robustness checks to these findings, including the impact of the introduction of unemployment insurance, and also experimented with alternative state assignments. I forgot to say that in our benchmark, all state variables are matched, are assigned on the basis of the state of birth. The results are even stronger when we match state variables by the resident state. Now, the next step is to ask whether these effects extend in the long run. So I'm going to take this group of women here, and I'm going to ask whether the effects persist 20 years later in 1960. when they are 35 to 64 years old. When we do have, we find that the results extend at precisely for the same cohort of women, the ones that were 25 to 44 years old in 1940. So still, these women in 1960, they work more in states that were more impacted by the Great Depression. And more interestingly, it is still the ever married women that are likely to work more. When we match our state covariates on the basis of the state of residence, we do find also significant effects for the slightly younger women, those that are 40 to 44 years old in 1960. So in this column and this column too, and these coefficients become somewhat larger. Also, interestingly, women 16 to 34 years old are not impacted, and these are individuals that were kids or unborn during the Great Depression, and for whom we wouldn't expect any direct impact of the shock. We did a number of robustness checks to these results. So for a subset of the pool cross sections, we looked at the intensive margin and we found positive effects. We controlled for other competing explanations, such as World War II or the increase in educational attainment. The results remain robust. We looked at whether our primary measure of the Great Depression can predict the employment outcomes in the pre-Depression era, and we didn't find any systematic effects. As an internal validity check, we followed this group of women in 1950 in the medium run, and we did observe the same cohort-specific labor supply effects. And lastly, we experimented with alternative measures of the Great Depression. We used the changes in retail sales that are available from Fishback by country, and which we aggregated at the CA level, and also changes in the real estate per capita income, a series constructed again by Fishback for a shorter time period. And using both measures and at the more disaggregate level, the retail sales, we observed the same cohort-specific patterns. So taking all the exercises that we've conducted, we are confident that these effects exist. They are robust, and we were able to rule out at least some obvious confounding explanations. So in the last part of the paper, we consider some possible mechanisms for these results. So in the short run, the fact that we observe effects for women relative to men and for married relative to unmarried women, this is suggestive of an added worker effect. Naturally, the question is, how come married women were able to enter the market given the presence of the marriage bars? Our reading of the literature is that women were likely to work in different jobs than men and in industries more shielded from the shock, such as in services, or they were teachers, nurses, they were working in clerical jobs or in textiles. Women delayed getting married to remain longer in the labor market. Some of them have concealed their marital status in order to retain jobs. And another explanation for which we do find some suggestive evidence is that they could have crowded out other groups of women, such as the African Americans, in sectors that were less likely to suffer by marriage bars, such as in services and in manufacturing. In fact, when we look at African Americans, we find that in the more impacted states, African American women, both in the short run as well as in the long run, they were less likely to be employed. It's possible that these positions were taken up by the white women in need of employment. Now, the next question is, how come these effects persist in the long run? So here we consider two explanations. The first is that of a labor supply shift. To address this possibility, along with employment, we are looking at wages. Wages only exist from 1940 onwards. What we find is that in states more severely affected by the Great Depression, the wages of women in the cohort that we're interested in decline relative to 1940, and we don't see that negative selection can explain this outcome. We're also looking at men. For men, we find that their employment propensity declined in the short run, but increased in the long run. And when I'm talking about men, I mean men that were likely to be the husbands of these women. They were of similar age. For those, we also observed that their wages declined between 1940 and 1960 in response to the shock. And in contrast to women, we do see that negative selection can largely explain part of this decline. So taking these elements together, we do think that the labor supply shift induced by the Great Depression is a possible argument, and that declines in the household's permanent income could have kept these cohorts of people longer in the labor market. The second possibility we are considering is that the Great Depression induced a structural change. It's possible that some of the states that were more severely impacted, they had a much slower recovery or they never fully recovered. To address this possibility, in our specifications, we control for the contemporaneous changes in real per capita income as a measure of local economic prosperity. And while we cannot rule out that such a change did occur, we don't find that it changes our findings at all. So just to wrap up, we are adding in this big part of the literature discussing the trends in female employment in the first half of the 20th century by documenting a novel link between the Great Depression and the entry in the labor force of a particular cohort of young women of working age at the time, possibly via an added worker effect. We do find that this link extends in the long run. It has a cohort-specific nature, and this group of women were essentially the first ones to break this long-standing pattern of permanent exit from the labor market upon marriage. While other explanations could have definitely been in place, we do think that our results are consistent with a decline in the permanent incomes of the households that kept them longer in the labor market. So that's all I had to say. Thank you. Liana?
Hello very much. Thank you very much, Adriana. If you have questions, it's a good idea to type them as the questions occur to you, because then we can do a better job at summarizing and synthesizing them. And I was trying to do that and I messed up a little bit. I apologize. That's why Grant sent the email to everybody, because I deleted Francis's question. So Francis's question says, interesting about marriage bars increasing during the 30s. Could the introduction of marriage bars be in part a reaction to increased female labor force participation? You don't need to bar people from doing something unless it's something they want to do. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
That's definitely part of the narrative, that the reason these bars became stronger was partly because people thought that women would take jobs from men. So that's definitely that's definitely a possibility brought up by economic historians. There was a limited supply of jobs, and the jobs were reserved to predominantly to men and to single women. That's a possibility.
Thank you. I don't know if I messed up anything. I don't see any other questions coming in right now. So Grant, if I messed up, can you please save me again? But in the meanwhile, while we figure out if there's any more questions coming from the audience, let me ask you something. Maybe you want to comment a little bit. How is this relevant to the COVID research? So in particular, you said that April 1st, 1930, when the census was conducted, was maybe a bit too early to catch up the labor supply effects. So do you anticipate with this new crisis that we're in, that the short-term effects that we saw in March and April of the labor force survey will be different from the long-term ones? And do you think that what you find in terms of white versus black female, white females potentially displacing black females and these things, do you anticipate that this will be relevant for the 2020 situation?
So I think what is interesting about these findings is that We rarely observe such a big shock, such that of the Great Depression. I mean, incomes fell by 20–25%. And we see that there are long-term effects. When people lose assets, they lose jobs, and there are effects on their permanent income. It is quite possible that, you know, additional people have to enter in the labor market and to catch up. Definitely times are different, right? At the time, there was a margin of reaction. Women were at home, married women were mostly at home. So one margin that the households could react is to allow these people that were at home to enter the market. Right now, most women are working. Will they be longer? Will they be working for a more extensive period of time? This is quite possible. So in that sense, yes, I do believe that such shocks that have a drastic impact on people's budget constraint, yes, they can have long-term effects in terms of the labor supply response.
Thank you, Andrea. Now we have two more questions. One is, have you looked at long-term incomes of Black women in the same cohort? Did the displacement persist? And let me read you the second question. Is from David Gray, and also congratulations on a very smooth presentation. He would also like you to please review your remarks regarding the presence or absence of selection effects on labor supply patterns. So maybe we want to go back to that slide where you were showing them.
Yeah, so the first question was about the African Americans. Yeah, so we do find that in the short term, African American women were less likely to work in states more severely affected. And we do find that these results extend in the long run. In other words, these were permanent displacements. So this is the outcome that we looked at, employment, prompted by economic historians who mentioned that African Americans faced very high unemployment rates, and in many cases they were displaced from those jobs so that poorer whites can take over. So we find that this was confirmed in the data. Now, you asked me about, I don't know if I can go back to my slides, actually. Okay, thank you, Grant. You asked me about selection. One second. Yes. So, so there is a possibility of negative selection, meaning that the women that are drawn in the labor market are mostly the low ability women that higher ability women are exiting the market. So we do a Heckman type correction where our exclusion restriction is the number of own family members included in the household. When we do this Heckman correction, while we do find that there was negative selection for women, we do not see that this negative selection takes away the negative impact, the decline we observe in women's wages. When we repeat the same thing for men, we do see that this decline partially goes away once we control for negative selection. Negative selection could, for men, it could be that that men that were in their early adulthood at the time, they didn't have the time or the opportunity to catch up by receiving training, and therefore they were sidetracked in terms of their occupations. And in line to that, we also see for men that they were less likely to be employed in the short run, more likely to be employed in the long run. And along with lower wages, it does suggest that there was sidetracking, and maybe the declines they experienced kept them in the market longer.
Thank you, Adriana. Another question is, for married women, do you look at husband situations, and do you consider early retirement possibility?
So we didn't match women to their husbands in 1960. The reason being is that the marital status of women changes over time. Some of them could have been divorced, widowed. What we did is that we looked at men 45 or 40 to 64 years old in 1960 that were likely to be the husbands of these women. And as I said, we do observe wage declines, and we do observe that they are working more in the long run. Now, having said that, I guess this probably goes against this idea of early retirement, if I understood well that question, since we do observe that in 1960, some of them are close to 60 years old, they are still in the labor market.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and for answering the questions that the audience has posed. And if there's any more coming, maybe we'll have some time in the end to revisit both papers. We are ready to move soon to Louis Pierre's presentation. And while we wait for Louis Pierre to come online, I don't see him online. Here he is. But let me just make another comment. And again, thanks to Grant Gibson, Friday's presentation is uploaded now. You've all received the notification. We can go and see what the two talks from Friday. It has been posted. So changing a little bit topics here, we move to Louis Pierre Lepage's presentation. Louis Pierre is from University of Michigan, and he's gonna talk to us about endogenous learning and how employers form biases. So you have the floor. And again, if you have questions about Louis Pierre, maybe it's good to send them earlier on so we can sort them by topic. And if not, we'll address them like Adriana's, and it seems to work very well so far. So I'm gonna mute myself and you've got the floor.
All right, thanks everyone for showing up. Today I'm going to talk about what is going to be my job market paper in the fall, titled Endogenous Learning and the Persistence of Employer Biases in the Labor Market.
Sorry, Louis Pierre, just to interrupt, you aren't sharing your screen. Do you need me to send the notification again?
Oh, I thought I was sharing my screen. Give me a second. Yeah, if you send me the notification again, I can try. What about now?
Yep. You're on slide 2, though. I don't know if that's
still good.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to jump into slide 2 right away. So outcome differentials across groups of workers are typically considered an important social issue in the labor market, and they're also typically considered to be quite persistent over time. From a discrimination standpoint, key to identify the role that discrimination potentially plays in contributing to outcome differentials across groups of workers is to identify the fundamental cause of differential treatment across groups of workers by employers. First theory we have for this is states-based discrimination, in which outcome differentials across groups of workers arise from fundamental employer preferences to hire or interact with certain groups of workers rather than others. We're going to get back a little bit later to taste-based discrimination, but most of what we're going to talk about today is the alternative explanation of statistical discrimination. In statistical discrimination, employers need to solve an information extraction problem where they try to predict the productivity of a potential worker, but under imperfect information about the individual, they rely on their group membership to try to infer information about their productivity. What is invariably assumed in these models is that while employers have perfect information employers have imperfect information about workers, so they need to learn about worker productivity, but they have perfect information on the underlying productivity of groups. So they need to learn about the individual, but they know the underlying productivity of groups. The direct result of that is that discrimination in these models is a rational response to true equilibrium group differentials. So if employers have correct relative beliefs about group productivity, then their behavior matches this relative productivity. What this does is rule out what has otherwise been an increasingly important alternative explanation for discrimination in economics, and that is the idea that employers may have incorrect or biased beliefs about the productivity of groups. Now, in many settings in a labor market setting, especially early on in an employer's hiring career, it might be plausible to think that through their own hiring experiences, an employer learns both about individuals, but also about the groups that they might belong to. Why has this not been considered a lot in the literature? Well, I think the prevailing view in a lot of the literature is that biased beliefs should not be expected to persist in competitive markets if they even arise at all. I think there are kind of two conceptual points behind this. First, there's a tendency to see biased beliefs as some kind of naive and efficient mistake by employers. And if so, then we think there are market forces like employer learning or competition that would tend to drive these out. And also that if it's some inefficient mistake that goes away with competition or time, then the distinction with taste may not be meaningful in certain contexts. I think the key for these two conceptual points is to think about whether we can recast biased beliefs, not as the result of some fundamental cognitive bias of employers, but rather as the systematic outcome of profit maximization and Bayesian updating in a labor market setting. This would make clear that we're moving quite far away from this naive mistake or cognitive bias, and also that biased beliefs could be meaningfully distinct from taste. And so today we're going to see whether we can recast biased beliefs in this way, using the idea that employers must learn about both individual workers, but also about the productivity of groups of workers. And so the research question is going to be, can endogenous employer learning about groups of workers lead to systematically biased beliefs over time across employers? And if so, can that generate persistent discrimination? So what the paper is going to do is first provide a new mechanism through which persistent negative biases arise endogenously across employers as an optimal hiring response. I'm going to put this mechanism in the formal model of statistical discrimination in the labor market that's going to focus on employers having to learn about the productivity of groups. I'm going to show that when there's initial information asymmetry, such that employers begin with better information on the productivity of one group rather than another, this leads to a trade-off that employers face between learning about group productivity versus maximizing current period profits. In that case, I'm going to show that hiring across groups is going to depend on an employer's beliefs about the group's productivity, as well as market clearing wage. And the nature of hiring interactions of an employer with groups of workers is going to lead to asymmetric learning, especially about the uncertain group's productivity over time. What I mean by this is that in the model, positive hiring experiences with the more uncertain group are going to lead employers to update their beliefs about the group's productivity upwards, and therefore increase their hiring of the group and their learning about their productivity. So in the model, positive biases are endogenously going to correct themselves through more hiring and learning. On the other hand, negative experiences are going to lead employers to update their beliefs about the group's productivity downwards, therefore reducing their incentives to hire again from the group, therefore they're reducing their learning about their productivity and leading to the persistence of negative biases. So across employers and over time, this is going to lead to a negatively skewed distribution of beliefs. And then I'm going to show that the distribution of beliefs can generate long-run discrimination in the form of a wage gap. Even when worker groups are completely equally productive, employers are profit maximizing Bayesians with unbiased priors about worker group productivity. Worker signaling and investment decisions are exogenous, so this is not going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy in which workers confirm employer biases. And even when there's market competition in the form of a higher exit rate for employers with biased beliefs. Most of what we're going to talk about today is going to be the theory, the model, but time depending, I'm going to touch on some related work in which I present evidence that's consistent with the core bias generating mechanism using both an online experiment and some administrative firm data for the US. Okay, so this touches on three strands of the literature mostly. There's a long tradition of discrimination models of the labor market. The difference here is we're starting from a statistical discrimination model in which we relax the assumption that employers start off with perfect information on groups, and instead we explicitly model this optimal learning about group productivity. This is going to lead to a framework where biased beliefs are systematically going to arise, and I'm going to show later that the model will also have many of the same intuitive features as models of taste-based discrimination. There's a growing strand of the literature that focuses directly on the potential that biases or stereotypes generate discrimination. Here, we're going to fundamentally look at how such biases or stereotypes could arise endogenously, even from profit maximizing invasion of dating. So a fairly important departure from the usual mechanisms. And then this is going to be a model of employer learning, but switched around a little bit because the focus is going to be on learning about groups rather than individual workers. Okay, a quick intuitive sketch of the mechanism that's going to drive things in the model. So the setting we're going to consider is two groups of workers, A and B. The idea in the background here is that group membership is a potentially relevant indicator of productivity for employers. For expositional simplicity, I'm going to focus on employers from group A, which you can see as a majority group in the setting. I'm going to assume that they know the productivity of their own group, but they're uncertain about that of group B. And the key is that they can learn about group B's productivity through hiring them. In that case, the optimal hiring across groups will depend on their beliefs about group productivity, specifically group B's productivity, and therefore their hiring history with these workers. So as I've said before, positive experiences will lead to more hiring and learning, which is going to correct these positive biases. On the other hand, I'm going to show that negative experiences can lead to decreases in hiring and learning that leads to their persistence. And so that leads to asymmetric learning across employers, which generates over time a negatively skewed distribution of beliefs. So that's the idea behind the mechanism. Now, what happens if we put this in a modeled labor market? So first today, especially with the time we have, we're going to focus on the simplest potential setting that we can use to work out the key implications of the mechanism. So we're going to look at a setting where there's no individual signal of productivity. So employers only use group membership at hiring to decide who to hire. Each employer hires one worker per period, and hiring signals are private. So the only way for an employer to learn about group B productivity is to hire from the group. So in the paper, I consider all these extensions in turn, and I show that they don't change the qualitative predictions of the model, but we'll see how much time we have to get to this today. I suspect not much. Workers from both groups are going to be perfect substitutes, going to have normally distributed productivity. For simplicity, I'm going to assume that employers know the variance in productivity. So this boils the learning problem down to learning about the mean productivity of group B for an employer. And again here, workers have fixed productivity and no outside option. So I want to stress that workers are going to play no role in generating discrimination against them. So this is not going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So employers are going to have prior beliefs about the mean productivity of group B, and I'm going to assume that these prior beliefs are going to be unbiased. So on average, employers are going to think both groups are equally productive. They're just not sure, and so through their learning, they confirm or not these beliefs. Employers are going to be wage takers, use one period contracts, and then the match will dissolve. So each period, the employer needs to hire a new worker, either from group A or group B. In that setting, the cumulative number of group B hires by a given employer by a given period is formed their information set, STJ. That is basically a collection of all the signals they've observed about group B's productivity. Using that, they update their beliefs about mu B, which is just going to follow the standard normal updating formula. And then for our purpose, what we're going to keep track of is the beliefs of an individual employer given an information set, psi STJ, and then the aggregate distribution of beliefs across employers that we're going to call cap psi T. Then what employers need to do is solve a dynamic expected profit maximization, where they take as given their current beliefs about group B productivity, and then the market clearing wage for group B, which is itself a function of beliefs about their productivity. Then an employer has to decide if they want to hire a group A worker, or below if they want to hire a group B worker. If they hire from group A, then their beliefs about the productivity of groups don't change because they already know the productivity of group A and they observe nothing new about group B. This also means that in the model, the wage for group A will be constant because their productivity is known. And what's going to be of interest is the wage gap. So how the wage for group B fluctuates compared to that of group A. If they hire from group B, then they get a worker from the group, so they observe a signal about their productivity, which they use to update their beliefs. The assumptions that are necessary in this model to ensure tractability is that of static wage expectations. So on average, employers are going to expect that the wage of group B next period is going to be equal to the wage of group B this period. The reason this is necessary for tractability is that it means I don't need to keep track in the state space of an employer's beliefs about the beliefs of all other employers about the mean productivity of Group B, which would kind of blow up the state space. Meaningfully, what this means is that if an employer only observes the wage in a given period, they're unable to take this wage and from that alone recover the entire distribution of beliefs of other employers about Group B. This appears particularly reasonable in practice when we think that the wage or the market clearing wage of a group in practice would be a complicated function of a lot of factors beyond just employer beliefs. And it's going to be useful in the model to define a lambda JT here as the relative willingness to pay of an employer for a Group B worker. So how much more or less an employer is willing to pay for a Group B worker rather than a Group A worker. The reason this is useful is that that's going to be what employers compare to the wage gap when they decide from which group to hire. Quickly, an equilibrium in this model will be a Markov process in which each period the labor market has to clear, employers are Bayesian updaters, and employers maximize expected profits according to the Bellman equation. So now with these pieces, we're ready to characterize how hiring will look like in the model. So proposition 1 describes optimal hiring. Basically, it says that optimal hiring will follow a cutoff rule where an employer will hire from Group B in a given period if and only if their current relative willingness to pay for the group is larger than a given cutoff value. And precisely this cutoff value by market clearing is going to be equal to the wage gap. So there are kind of two key takeaways here. First, by market clearing, the wage for Group B each period will be determined by the relative willingness to pay of the marginal employer. The marginal employer here being the employer with the lowest relative willingness to pay for Group B, which is a function of their beliefs about their productivity, but then must still hire from Group B in order to clear the market. And then the second takeaway is that it is optimal for an employer to stop hiring from Group B following negative experiences at a given market wage if their current beliefs are low enough that their willingness to pay falls below the cutoff. What happens if we leave employers in the market forever to hire and potentially learn about group productivity? So how do we characterize the asymptotic distribution of beliefs given this hiring rule? So this is what proposition 2 does. Proposition 2 basically says that you'll have a group of employers in the long run who will be above the hiring cutoff, so above the marginal employer. They will keep drawing signals about Group B productivity and therefore correctly learn their true productivity. So this is just Bayesian consistency as they keep observing signals. You have another group of workers that at some point following negative experiences will fall below the hiring cutoff. And if they remain below the hiring cutoff in the long run, then their beliefs simply carry over. And so you can show that there's going to be two groups of employers, a mass point of employers with correct beliefs, and then a range of employers with negatively biased beliefs below that. And so the takeaway here is that if employers optimally hire in this market, even asymptotically, this asymmetric learning based on the nature of hiring experiences is going to create persistent biases and a negatively skewed distribution of beliefs across employers. The next step is, does that create discrimination? So in this case, in the form of a wage gap. So this is characterized in proposition 3, which states that the wage for Group B in the model can be shown to be strictly decreasing in time and converge to a constant that is strictly below that of the wage of Group A. So the intuition here is threefold. First, in the market, you have a group of employers above the hiring cutoff that will eventually have their beliefs concentrated around the true value mu. So this is just because they draw signals of mean mu. There will be positive mass here, both above mu and below mu, just by the randomness of drawing signals. This means that the beliefs of the marginal employer will eventually fall below mu, and eventually as their willingness to pay falls below that of a Group A worker, a wage gap will be created. So the wage for Group B will fall below the wage of Group A. Then the question is, can that ever revert with time and experience? And the answer is no. By market clearing, you can show that once that happens, the wage gap will keep growing. This is simply because in any given period, you have a group of employers above the hiring cutoff who will observe a signal. Some of them are going to observe a negative signal relative to what their current beliefs are, and they might fall below the current hiring cutoff. So then for the market to clear, the wage for Group B has to fall to keep the mass constant above the cutoff. And then lastly, as beliefs about group productivity converge, eventually the wage will converge and stop evolving. The big takeaway here is that the model predicts persistent discrimination against group B, namely, they will be paid a wage below their expected productivity, even in the long run, from this initial relative information uncertainty about their productivity. What happens if you add competition to the model? So quickly, here I consider a setting where there's a entry and exit rate of the market each period, delta, and that this rate can be higher for biased employers, which is the notion of competition. The key point here is that bias is not from a fundamental state of the world, but endogenously arises as a function of hiring experiences. So competition can drive out individual bias, but it will not necessarily affect market outcomes if these employers that get driven out are replaced by employers who face a similar learning problem and may develop biases through their experiences. So the takeaway is that basically here it will depend on the actual values of entry and exit in the market. There's a threshold value. If there is enough competition, then that might eliminate discrimination in the long run, but it's not any degree of competition, even in the long run, that would eliminate this type of discrimination. So I consider a series of model extensions. I'm going to skip them, but if you're interested, send me an email and I'll be happy to talk about them more. I'm going to jump into the implications for the literature. So this is a framework to study biased beliefs in the labor market. As I've said before, this starts from a statistical discrimination framework, except that some employers systematically develop biased beliefs. They might therefore appear prejudiced because their behavior does not actually reflect true group differentials. So my model, as I've just said, generates a discrepancy between the average performance and the average pay of a group of workers, namely group B. This is not something you generally get in statistical discrimination, but is an intuitive feature of models of taste-based discrimination. So in the paper, I push the relationship between the two further and show that my model actually predicts analogous predictions to the Becker model, but replacing notions of preferences with notions of biased beliefs. So the model can rationalize apparent taste-based discrimination as the result of incorrect statistical discrimination. It provides a different way to understand prejudice in economics, not as a given state of the world, but rather as the result of life experiences, potentially distorting beliefs and views in a way that ends up not representing reality. And the key insight for models of discrimination in the literature is that it's possible then to generate many of the key insights of prejudice-based models, but from uncertainty, without deviating from profit maximization, or relying on utility functions or preferences. Now, as far as empirical work goes, biased beliefs can be seen as sort of somewhat redefining the relationship between the classical theories of discrimination. It kind of stresses that taste and statistical discrimination are not necessarily distinct or exhaustive, and that there might be biased beliefs that are this complicated thing in the middle. The model can act as somewhat of a substitute for some of the role of taste-based discrimination, while being intuitively complementary to many models of statistical discrimination. A key empirical prediction in the model is that providing salient information about groups of workers through either interaction or learning could help mitigate discrimination in the long run. This is not something that is predicted by standard statistical discrimination or by taste-based discrimination. It provides a new lens to analyze policies like affirmative action or worker subsidies, as well as contact theory between groups of individuals. As I've said before, in related work, I test the implications of this bias generating mechanism. First, I have an online experiment where I have participants in the role of employers face this problem that I've set up before, where they need to over time choose between hiring from two groups of workers, and then I give them better information initially on the productivity of one group than another, and I show that as predicted by the mechanism, this leads to a negatively skewed distribution of beliefs about the productivity of the other group. And then in joint work with Alan Benson at the University of Minnesota, we use administrative firm data from a large US retailer where we have a lot of managers across a large number of stores in the US. And we provide evidence consistent with this endogenous learning mechanism in this broad labor market setting. So namely, we find that the nature of early experiences, particularly with Black workers in this context, leads to persistent changes in their hiring. So namely, early negative hiring interactions with Black workers leads to persistent decreases in their hiring across managers, and that this is not the same for white workers, which here would be the group about which there's better information. And so this leads to this persistent hiring differential across. All right, and then to conclude, so the focus today was on presenting a new mechanism through which persistent negatively biased beliefs could arise endogenously as an optimal hiring response. When put in a model of the labor market that focused on learning about groups, this made clear that you could expect a negatively skewed distribution of beliefs across employers, and that could generate long-run discrimination. The model has features of taste-based discrimination, but set within a statistical discrimination framework and kind of linked together through bias beliefs. And then lastly, I just want to stress that the implications of endogenous learning, when you think that employers might decide to learn about the state of the world based on their hiring experiences, their individual experiences, could have implications that go beyond discrimination. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louis-Pierre, for an excellent presentation. Still waiting for questions from the audience to come in. Let me just start a little bit by saying that I think your model is fantastic and extremely useful from a policy point of view, right? We can apply it to immigration stories that we care about in Canada, where we think we know more about the native workers, and when immigrants come, we don't have information, and how we learn matters. And university quality may be another policy application, right? So we see, I'm from Guelph, employers like to hire Guelph graduates because they know something, and they may be reluctant to hire graduates because they don't have enough information. And I like your asymmetry story about how if your beliefs are too good, then they come back down, and if they're negative, they stay negative. I have a couple of questions about that, but I see questions coming from the audience, so I'm gonna wait with my questions. While I sort through those coming from the audience, can you comment a little bit on the role of affirmative action policy? If in the context of your model, how do you see that?
Right, so the key with affirmative action usually is that, a classical code-and-Larry analysis is that affirmative action policies could backfire by creating endogenous investments of workers and therefore, create discrimination that way. What my model says is not that this doesn't necessarily arise, but my model says that affirmative action policies could have this benefit that is generally not regarded in these analyses. And that benefit would be that an affirmative action policy can induce learning by employers. So by forcing them or inducing them to hire from a given group that is targeted by the policy, this can lead to long-run learning about their productivity and therefore a long-run increase in their hiring. This is similar to, there's a paper from Conrad Miller that's now at Berkeley that finds that affirmative action contracts lead about the hiring of African Americans in this setting, lead to long-run increases in the hiring of the group. And so that, for example, my model provides an explanation for why we might expect this increased learning that is kind of in the long run, even when these affirmative action contracts end, because the learning still kicks in.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you Kevin Devereux's question. He says, nice paper. How do population shares of groups A and B affect the distribution of beliefs in equilibrium?
Yes, so it is an important parameter of the model, the group size, if only because basically that's what determines where the marginal employer will be in the distribution. And so technically the model can predict discrimination no matter what the relative size of group B is, but specifically when we go into a setting of an applied setting, we often think of discrimination as targeting a more minority group. And then the implications with this is that basically the model predicts endogenously that the fraction of employers that must have biased beliefs to generate a wage gap is exactly the fraction of employers that will have biased beliefs. So this is all endogenous in the model. So technically, it doesn't matter for how we think of a wage gap, but when we think of in practice, for example, we might think that it's easier to avoid hiring a minority group following negative experiences. So if I have negative experiences with a group that only forms 10% of the market, then I can avoid hiring and learning about the productivity. On the other hand, if I have negative experiences with a group that is 90% of the labor market, then that makes it harder going forward for this mechanism, this bias gender mechanism to kick in.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to summarize two other questions. I hope that they are related. Laura Brown says, this is a very interesting paper. Are you planning on looking at the relative effectiveness of various policies in affecting beliefs? And Tammy Shirley says, this is an interesting result in the model regarding persistence of discrimination despite competition. I look forward to reading more about testing of this. Would like to think more about how this creates barriers to hiring. And Laura also has a follow-up, says, is the size of the wage gap correlated with group size? Then this is related to your answer to Kevin's question. I'm sorry, maybe that was a bit too much in one. Maybe take your time to prioritize how you want to answer.
Yes, so I'm gonna try to summarize that into one package. So as far as applications, I think there's quite a lot of applications across a large number of areas. For example, the school quality is one that I had not heard until now, so that's good. My focus now has been on providing specific evidence that is consistent with employers doing this endogenous learning. And so, and I've done it in kind of two very opposite settings, where one is an online experiment and the other one is all the way just across the internal-external validity trade-off, where I look at broad firm data. I do want to eventually try to look at policy implications, so using exogenous variation from a potential policy. The key here is to find a policy that would meaningfully change the information set of employers in a given market about a group of employers. And so then you could start to try to trace that back to the mechanism. This is something that I'm interested in working with, but so far I haven't gone much in this direction, just as a question of time, but this is an interesting avenue, I think. And about the size of the group, actually, I think that the implication, technically, if you look at just the comparative static of the parameter of group size, you would expect a larger wage gap if the group is larger, group B is larger. That being said, this isn't a market clearing model, and so the implications would be a little different if you consider, for example, a search model, which is something that I would also be interested in working out, given the interesting implications that would differ. But yeah, in the paper I have simulations that show how the predicted wage gap would change with the model parameters. And off the top of my head, I do think that a larger group B means a larger expected wage gap, all else equal.
Thank you very much. Grant Gibson has a question. He says, what would happen if there were a shock to the model? Which workers are first to be fired? And then can you use this to inform our expectations about COVID-19 recovery and the disparate impact of the shock?
Yeah, so this made me think of, so one idea in the labor literature that does have some evidence is that, for example, in the case of Black workers, that they're usually the first to get laid off or fired, and then the last to be hired when the economy recovers. And so I was actually thinking about this, but in the context of the Great Recession, since it overlaps with the sample size of the firm data I'm using. But you could use a shock like this if you think that a big shock like that had an heterogeneous effect geographically. So it impacted local labor markets worse than others. Then you could use that as an exogenous shock to the hiring of new managers or employers that entered the market at that time and started hiring. So this could create exogenous variation in the fraction of minority workers or immigrant workers or black workers, whatever would be of interest at that time. And you would expect that if there's this kind of salient exogenous change in their early learning, that this could lead to persistent differentials in their hiring, even after the economy has recovered. That's another thing that I think is interesting and that I've thought somewhat of, not in the COVID context, but I guess you can kind of translate it to that context.
Thank you very much. Kevin has a follow-up question. We still have 5 minutes for questions about this paper, and then maybe if we need, we'll open up to more general questions towards the end if there's anything remaining. But Kevin says search model should explain the employment rate gap. I don't know if you want to comment on it.
Yeah, so that's exactly on the mark. That's exactly one of the reasons why I think it's interesting, because in practice, when we think of discrimination, there's a lot of focus on the wage gap, but generally we find that the unemployment gap might actually be a bigger issue, a bigger differential than the wage gap. And of course, with a market clearing model, it's useful to work out the implications of the wage gap. But when you go to a search framework, then you can try to see if this type of mechanism could help jointly explain both the wage gap and the unemployment gap. It's also interesting because similar to what the Dan Black 1995 did for the Becker taste-based model, it shows that in a search framework, the beliefs that matter for determining the wage gap are the beliefs of the average employer rather than marginal employer. And so when group B is a minority group, you might expect to generate a larger wage gap in a search framework than in a market clearing framework. Because in the market clearing framework, you have this fundamental force of the market that tends towards segregation. So there's no frictions, so you would just tend to have segregation rather than wage gap. So those are two reasons why a search framework, I think, would be interesting.
Thank you very much. Maybe we still have like 3 minutes for your paper before we open it a bit more wider. Maybe something that I don't really know how to wrap my head around is the asymmetry. I really love the asymmetry, and I buy that it can work like that. But it means we can't really use it for a relative, in a relative way. So for instance, I know that men are very good workers and I have a bad prior about women's productivity, therefore it works in explaining the gender wage gap. But what about if I want to frame it the other way around? I know that women are okay with productive workers, but I have a belief that men are much better workers, right? So if I try to look at this relative by saying I know about women and I think men are better, that means that in this kind of setting, the gender wage gap would disappear. So can we reconcile the two ways?
So I will say one thing that is simplified in the model is that both groups have completely equal productivity. So that also makes the learning problem simpler because both groups are equal. And so the point is one better than another. If you thought that women were better, or you knew about women, no matter if they're better or worse, and you were uncertain about men, then what you would find is that basically the belief distribution would start above for men rather than women. And so then you might have a wage gap in favor of men. And as this endogenous learning happens, these beliefs about the productivity of men should be corrected. And so they should, go to around the same beliefs as the women. And then in that case, you could predict that, yeah, this would get rid of the gender wage gap. So I guess there's kind of a couple of points. First, this needs to be in a setting where you would be certain of the productivity of women and uncertain about the productivity of men. But I think the big takeaway of the model is that while for simplicity, I'm assuming that one group is certain and one group is uncertain, the big key is really relative uncertainty. And so in that framework, I would say that probably for most employers, in a lot of, especially if we think of like fields that have more men generally or historically, then you would think that if anything, the beliefs about the productivity of men should start off more certain than that of women. And those are the kind of sectors where I would expect a wage gap. But if you abstract it from all of that and you were in a world where you've described where I start with perfect information on women, not on men, and they're about equally sized, and I start endogenously learning, then yes, that could predict that the gender wage gap would go away. But I think that would abstract from a lot of kind of aspects of real life that get in the way of that happening for that particular scenario, I guess.
I agree. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions coming in, so maybe I'll just wrap up by thanking both presenters and the organizers and inviting you to attend the 2 remaining seminar workshops, which are tomorrow and Thursday, same time, 12:15 to 1:30. And if there's any general comment or question about either of the 2 papers presented today, we can still address it. I think officially time is until 12:25, but we always until 1:25, but we always planned until 1:30. So if there's any general comments that anybody wants to relay now, if not, we are gonna collect all the questions and we'll provide them to the presenters. We were thinking whether we should put that online as well, but we are not entirely clear about privacy and how that would be received. So maybe I can invite Andriana to join us again, just to thank both presenters again. And we'll wrap up with that. I don't see Andriana. Okay, there she is. Thank you both, Andriana and Louis-Pierre. I really enjoyed both papers, and I'm sure the audience did as well. Thank you for joining us and providing a little bit of social engagement in these difficult times. Thank you very much. And with this, I don't see any other questions or comments coming in. Thank you very much, and hopefully you enjoyed it as much as we did.
Thanks.
Have a great time, everybody. And now I think it will be up to Grant to close the workshop. See you tomorrow, everybody, or hear you tomorrow. Interact with everybody tomorrow again. Have a great day.